You've discovered the Technoprogressive Hub. Join us to fight for a high-tech and radically democratic future. I'm talking today to David Wood. David is a prominent British futurist, author, and pioneer of the smartphone industry. He has a career spanning over 25 years in mobile computing. He's best known as the co-founder of Symbian, the world's first successful smartphone operating system. By 2012, software under his leadership had resided on more than 500 million devices globally. David currently serves as chair of the London Futurists, very, very productive there. We'll be talking about some of his work. And he's led that since 2008. Under his guidance, it's grown into one of the world's largest foresight communities and certainly produces quite a bit of foresight content. He serves on our board of directors for the IET and also is executive director of the Longevity Escape Velocity Foundation, which we'll talk about a little bit, that advocates for the radical extension of healthy human life. He's a prolific author. He's written one book about technoprogressivism, transcending politics, but in the general technoprogressive vein, he's also written Sustainable Superabundance, which we'll talk about, the Singularity Principles, and the Abolition of Aging, an argument for curing aging. So David, and one thing that Gemini said about you as I was doing my due diligence here is, David is the central node in a lineage of British thinkers who moved transhumanism from a science fiction subculture to policy-adjacent philosophy. So the Overmind thinks highly of your contributions, David.
Wow. Gemini is going up in my evaluations.
Now, I wanted to start on a lighter note. That John Haidt has been convincing everyone in the world that cell phones are the root of all evil. Is there anything you want to apologize for, given your central role in addicting us to this device?
You know, we talked a lot in the early days of smartphones. So when I say early days, late 1990s, early 2000s, we talked a lot about some of the problems we anticipated. We anticipated that the battery life would be too short. We anticipated that people would lose their data. And we anticipated there would be viruses and malware on the phones. We did not anticipate that these devices would be given to young children. We did not anticipate that they would drive people to suicidal tendencies. We did not anticipate they would lead people into competitions for being liked more than others. So there's a broad picture there. It's hard to anticipate the downsides of technology, even when you are being thoughtful.
Mm-hmm. So it sounds like you do think like this experience has informed your approach to technology policy.
It has. And I'm broadly with Jonathan Haidt that there are dangers in giving a lot of smartphone usage to people whose brains are still rapidly forming. The puberty is slightly post-puberty. And I'm not sure I would argue for a complete ban, but my goodness, we need guardrails and we need to work out what these guardrails are. And by the way, we're going to have to change the guardrails because all the time there are new innovations. We're going to need to put as much effort into working out the guardrails as we did into developing the technology in the first place.
I completely agree. And I've actually softened in terms of my regulatory approach, softened in the sense of gotten stricter about the regulation of cell phones and LLMs on the grounds that I do think we need to age gate these things and have specific LLMs that are appropriate for interacting with kids. And the only way that we can implement that is with ID verification, identity verification, which is the sticking point for me because I don't want the internet to be completely locked down in terms of what people say is always traceable back to them. But on the other hand, I don't see any way around it in this domain. Do you see? I mean, I think if we have one big identity verifier that is like a third party, that's like the ideal situation, because then you can like have I'm an adult certificate that you show to everybody and you don't have to show them anything else. That's my kind of ideal model. But have you thought about this issue?
Yeah, I mean, ideally, we can learn from what the crypto community talks about, that we should be able to prove that we are a certain age without needing to say who we are. Our other aspects of our identity don't need to be disclosed. And people have various mechanisms in mind for that. So we have to give up some elements of privacy, but it should be in a system where the privacy is given up is minimal. Like when I go and see my doctor, I may talk about things with my doctor that I wouldn't talk about with other people. When I talk with my lawyer, again, there is a limited disclosure. And when somebody is thinking about a change in their ideology or a change in their philosophy, they may try something out. They don't want that necessarily to be broadcast to the entire world until they're sure that they are going to go through with such a transition. So there should still be strong privacy, and the access to key information must be done in a very careful way without it all ending up in the hands of Big Brother.
Mhm. Well, yes, an evolving terrain. We'll see. Some of the U.S. states are beginning to experiment with bans and certainly device bans in schools are going to be very popular, but regulating access to LLMs for kids and other kinds of restrictions on this. And I favor the European approach of mandating that you have algorithmic choices, because that's part of the AI Act in the EU, is that you should always have an alternative to have a chronological feed in whatever you're looking at and not just an algorithmic feed. I don't know. I'm sure you saw the study that just came out that showed that 3 weeks spent on X makes you considerably more conservative in your political views because the algorithm's so skewed. Okay, let's talk about super democracy. In your book, Transcending Politics, which I discovered, by the way, is on the reading list also of The Alternative UK, which so you have fans who consider your work to be essential reading for politics of the 21st century. But you promote what you call super democracy. And what are the elements when you imagine a super democracy?
So I use this term as a contrast to various other supers or the S's that some transhumanists talk about. So David Pearce famously has talked about the three S's of transhumanism: super longevity, in which we are much healthier for much longer; super intelligence, in which we are freed from some of the cognitive biases and mistakes that evolution has programmed into us; and David Pearce also talks about a super happiness, because evolution doesn't particularly care whether or not we were happy. It made us egotistical and envious and disruptive and alienated a lot of the time. Can we do better? And he said, yes. But I want to focus also on the social dimension of what we have inherited. We have inherited various aspects of relating to each other, in which it is often the right thing for our genes that we are deceitful to each other. It's often the right thing for our genes that we abuse power, whether it's in individual relationships or whether it's in broader relationships. Again, I say we have to transcend what tendencies evolution gave us. And so super democracy is just a broad way of saying, let's fix the relationships we have with each other so that we do fully respect each other. We're all part of the conversation about what we need to do. It's not just the most powerful people who get to set the rules. On the contrary, it should be a global conversation about what the global rules are and a local conversation about what the local rules are.
So when you say that we need to overcome some of our mammalian impulses in order to have an effective democracy, are you thinking also of moral enhancement, or are you just thinking of institutional change?
There are moral enhancements on that list of things that technology can do for us to allow us to cooperate better. Because some of our tendencies to fight with each other, to yaboo in the political world, some of our tendencies to go hunting for bad things we can say about each other, that is driven by our current human nature or aspects of our human nature, and moral enhancement may make us less inclined to do these things. It may make us more inclined to look for the goodness in each other. So, moral enhancement in principle will magnify the latent angelic aspects of our nature rather than the latent diabolical aspects. So that's part of it. But institutions are absolutely key too. And it shouldn't just be thought of as that if we fix all the individuals, then naturally we'll get working better together. I think we are constrained by the set of incentives in which we operate under. We're constrained by which rules are set in place, and setting the rules better is often a faster route to a more harmonious conclusion than getting people to adjust their human nature.
So I think it's fair to say that your background, you come more from the political center or the center left, someplace like that. And I'm more of the left kind of person. And one of the differences between those two perspectives is an understanding of power. And so, in terms of democracy, how much of a problem do you think it is that we have unequal power in society that then deforms the way that democracies work? So, like our current oligarchs, our tech oligarchs, are examples of enormous wealth being used to deform political power.
So in the last year, I've been talking more and more about the oligarch control problem
Mhm.
as a parallel to the AI control problem. And if we look ahead at things may go wrong as technology becomes more powerful, one failure mode is that the AI itself will be out of control. We won't be able to align it. We will try to get some results out of it, but the actual results will be different. But there's also this oligarch control problem, which is that the most powerful people in society, the ones whose businesses are generating the most wealth, people who are connected in other ways, they may become even more powerful as technology delivers a larger share of the world's economy to them. And we are poised to have bigger winner takes all effects than ever because our technologies are now global and the people who have slightly better algorithms can fast outpace the second or third place. That's the risk. So we could end up not just with the multi-billionaires that we got today, what is it, centi-billionaires? We will fairly soon have trillionaires and maybe even deca-trillionaires. And these will be, if we are not careful, completely beyond the control of the rest of society. The risk is, of course, that the rest of society won't have any economic value and won't have any political value anymore. In the past, the aristocracy had some need for the muscle power and the fighting power of the population as a whole. They needed soldiers, they needed people to work in factories, they needed people to run the economy. But as more aspects of the economy are capable of being automated, there will be less economic value for most people. This is what's sometimes called the economic singularity. The bulk of the population will no longer be able to earn a living by selling their services to the market. So if we have no longer economic value, and if we lose the ability to strike or do something else that can sway the results of politics, the people who are in power will increasingly be tempted to disregard the rest of us. And they may say currently, oh, of course, they are supporters of humanity. But we've seen what happens in some cases. There are some of the oligarchs who seem to care a lot more about the white South Africans, for example, than about the bulk of the people living in Africa. So they're already having a limitation in the group of people that they want to support. And this could get worse unless we put things in place to prevent that.
I have to say, David, you're sounding quite Marxist if you're saying that capitalists would sooner see all of us non-productive gobblers dead than have to feed us with the UBI, which I think is correct. But
I'm not saying that's true for everyone,
yeah,
but the human nature is a funny thing, and people who may start off by saying that they're on the side of humanity may flip.
the oligarch turn, the tech right turn in Silicon Valley, the support for MAGA, the Doge, the use of international platforms to harass Britons and Europeans to vote for fascist parties. It's put a big albatross. I mean, we had an albatross already around the futurist neck, around the transhumanist neck of the history of eugenics and other things that are tagged to us, I think, unfairly. But it's not entirely unfair to say that these guys have become poster children for some transhumanist ideas, and they were certainly central funders of it. What do we need to do to rescue? I mean, I have my answer is the Technoprogressive Project, which is to remind people that there is a version of futurism that takes all of these egalitarian social concerns, freedom concerns seriously. But I think a lot of people are still going to be seeing us as burdened by associations with these billionaires. So, what's your strategy in relation to that?
Yeah, so my strategy is changing, I think. If I reach over for one of my books, this one here, Vital Foresight, the case for active transhumanism, you'll see
Mhm.
there's the T word, the
Yeah,
transhumanist word is on the cover.
you
And
did not shy away.
I started this very book by saying, you can just about see it here, transhumanism. Don't put that word in the cover of your book. Many people were saying that the T word was toxic, you know. And I tried in that book in 2022, probably 2021, probably. I tried to defend transhumanism against what I called the transhumanist shadow. Transhumanist shadow I defined as people who went along with some of the transhumanist ideas, but who downplayed some of the what I consider the core aspects. So a core aspect of transhumanism, as I understand it, going all the way back to 1998, the Transhumanist Declaration, is an awareness of existential risks, that things could go wrong. Not all change is progress. We need to set up forums and institutions to guide this wisely. So there is an awareness of risk. But what we've often seen is a downplaying of that risk. We've seen more of the people with the transhumanist community become accelerationists, saying, well, it's all going to work out. Don't worry about the risks. The technology will work out the risks, solve the risks on the way. So that was one example of an element in the transhumanist shadow. And I think at least there are about 10 such elements. There is sometimes overhyping when people say, hey, I've got the solution. The solution is we just do that. And they're not actually being scientific anymore. And I think transhumanism is about properly embracing the scientific approach. Not a narrow scientific approach, but a broad scientific understanding, including psychology and sociology and all the other aspects. But we do see some people who latch onto one kind of vision of the future. Elon Musk putting satellites or data centers into space, digging tunnels under the ground, and connecting new electrodes into the brains. And a lot of that probably won't work for various reasons we can go into. So that's just two examples. So I tried to fight transhumanism away from the transhumanist shadow, and I think I've lost that battle. And I'm no longer sure if I were to write another version of this book in 2026, I would still put transhumanism on the cover. So that's why I tend to talk instead about sustainable superabundance or techno-progressive a future. I mean, I still talk about transhumanism from time to time. I argue that, you know, the future must have a bigger vision than just humans as they are today. It's a credible vision that humans will be enhanced in the various S's that I mentioned: super longevity, super happiness, super intelligence, and super democracy. That is a credible vision, but maybe the T word, the transhumanist word, needs to be deprioritized simply because there are these other toxic connotations.
Well, you know, this is since you joined us at the beginning of the IET, this has been central to the IET's problematic the whole time. As we started as an organization that wanted to give some cover, some plausible deniability to people who wanted to talk about all the same things that we wanted to talk about, but just didn't feel like they should be labeled with an ist, that wouldn't help their political or academic careers. And I have also had since at least 2014 when we met in Paris for the and drafted that techno-progressive declaration. I've had the feeling that transhumanism was just too thin a political ideology to organize something like a party around. Do you want to talk a little bit about your experience? Because you gave it the best, one of the best shots. I mean, there's still a trickle of transhumanist party activity here in the States, but I think the UK effort was one of the best that there was given, and it wasn't terribly successful. You want to tell us about that?
Sure. So it started in the US. Zoltan Istvan, good publicist. He knows how to get his name and his ideas in social media. He created the US Transhumanist Party and said he would run for the president. And some people in the UK came to me and said, well, we don't want some other non-core transhumanist taking the idea and running with it. A number of us who had long links with the transhumanist community in the UK, we should set up our own party. So there were about six of us to start off with. We declared it as a party. We went through the official registration process. I was officially the treasurer, which had the most onerous responsibilities in terms of doing the reporting. We had several different people who were leaders from time to time. I think I was probably a leader for longer than anybody else. But the real crunch is who's going to vote for a minority party in our first past the post electoral system? You know, somebody who might quite like some of our ideas, if we could agree on enough of them, they're going to worry that their votes will be wasted, especially in times when There's a lot of parties around that people definitely don't want to come into power. So with the first past the post system, people think, well, I'm going to vote for the party that's can credibly get in, which I like the most, which is often not the ones they particularly like, but they have to make this decision. So I thought for a while, hey, there's a difference for the mayoral elections because for a while the UK had a different system for voting in the mayor in which people could vote twice. You could vote for your first candidate and an alternative choice. And so I did think for a while that maybe it'd be worthwhile that we would put up a candidate for the mayor of London in, I think, 2024. So I was for a while toying with the idea of putting myself forward as the mayor of London, though I'm not a person who enjoys knocking on doors or going around, and you have to get signatures from each of the 33 different boroughs in London. So it's quite a job. And at the same time, two other things happened in my life. One, I got appointed to a new role in the Longevity Escape Velocity Foundation, which I realized I wanted to do. And we may talk about that later, and that would take a lot of my time. And secondly, the Conservatives changed the voting rules again. They said, well, we're not going to do this modern thing. We're going back to the time-honored first past the post system. So I thought, this is never going to happen. And in addition to the operational difficulties, there was the fact that we transhumanists often couldn't agree on policies. So we actually split early on among some of us who wanted to have strong links with Europe and others who bought into the Brexit ideology. And people still are divided along these scores. There are some people sympathetic to transhumanism who think the EU is the devil, and the EU is bureaucracy that slows down innovation, and anything Britain can do to get away from the EU is good. Whereas I was much more on the side of, well, the EU is far from perfect, but it's arguably one of the best experiments in federalism in the world, and we should fix it. No, we came to almost to blows, some of us, over what we should do with that. So I think you're right that just saying you're a transhumanist doesn't give you the answers to some of these other political questions. And so in the end, I went back to saying what we should do is we should try and reach people in all political parties. There may be some right-leaning transhumanists who can be inspired to say more about transhumanist ideas, and left-leaning transhumanists, and lots of others too, pardon me.
Excellent. Well, let's go back to some of the structural issues about politics. You, under the super democracy idea, you were impressed with some of the experiments with liquid democracy. Those were, I mean, you wrote that a decade ago, and now
Yeah.
there's quite a bit of evidence of their working and not working since then. Have you changed your mind about liquid democracy type experiments?
It's not on my list of 12 things anymore. I have a list of 12 things that I tend to talk about in terms of what super democracy means, and it got squeezed out in my last rewrite. I think it's got replaced by just general systems for decentralized decision making, in
Hmm.
which I'm a bit vaguer about how that will work because there's a whole bunch of different ideas and I can't get my head around all of them. But the idea is that there might be alternative forms of money or alternative forms of reputation management. So liquid democracy may or may not be valuable. I'll put more focus on citizens' assemblies. Citizens' assemblies are when people are sort of randomly selected to come and discuss a difficult issue, and a bit like we are selected to go on jury to decide whether somebody's guilty or innocent of a crime. And it's a very fascinating experience being on a legal jury because initially you think, who are all these other jurists? And at first, you're not quite sure what each of them are going to say. But in the course of a discussion, when you go out and you decide, you can reach a consensus. At least the times I've been on jury service, it started off by being quite divided, and ultimately we did get a consensus. And not everybody was completely happy with the outcome, but people were saying, well, yeah, it's fair enough. This is probably the right answer. And it's the same with some of the topics that citizens' assemblies look at. And there are some famous examples in Ireland, a discussion of in which circumstances should same-sex marriage be tolerated and when should abortion be tolerated. And people there had very different views initially on abortion or same-sex marriage. But over a course of time, they reached the view that, well, this is the recommendation we should give to society as a whole, even though some people wouldn't have chosen it themselves, they could see, well, we've been through a fair process. We've got the experts involved, we've understood the issues, and we do need some rules in society on this, so these are the right ones. So citizens' assemblies are something that I have a lot more time for. And I think AI can actually help the facilitation of citizens' assemblies because sometimes citizens' assemblies don't work. There's a lot of skill in actually getting people to discuss and agree. Just like there's rules for how a legal jury operates, and people are given guidance on what to say and what to do. In the same way, there should be best practice for how citizens' assemblies work, and the AI can actually guide people, I think, in these conversations. Not that the AI is going to make the decisions, but the AI will be asking questions and will be a great source of information when people say, "Tell me again, what is such and such?" And or what are the pros and cons of abortion at 24 weeks or whatever, and the AI will help them on that point.
Yeah, Audrey Tang in Taiwan helped implement a system called Polis, which, in terms of the bottom-up deliberation tools that you're talking about, one of the things that Polis does that I think is really cool is it will identify people who are making arguments that bridge both sides of a debate and highlight upvote their responses so that more people see them. And if those kinds of systems can help us overcome, the polarization and toxicity that we are experiencing, that'd be fantastic. I'm not terribly
Absolutely.
optimistic that the technology is going to do it, but yeah.
Well, the other thing a technology can do, it can mimic what the best human negotiators do. Human negotiators are on a spectrum as well. Some of them have a great track record in getting almost sworn enemies eventually to reach some agreement. Others are not so good at it. And ideally, an AI can learn by seeing how the best human negotiators operate and then can help to reach an agreement between initially warring parties or strongly divergent parties. And in this, it won't just be trying to elevate the human suggestions that seem to have the most promise. It can also be synthesizing and offering, well, I've heard you say this and I've heard you say that. Have you ever considered this middle role? And I think AI could be part of offering up suggestions for interesting new compromises that people will say, well, actually, now that you mention it, yeah, we could live with this as a new synthesis.
Mhm. One of the issues that the IET was confronting when we got started and we were trying to differentiate ourselves from some of the other transhumanists out there was the role of the government, whether there should be a government in the first place, because some didn't think that there should be, and if there was a government, what roles it had in regulating drug safety. So clinical trial reform and drug accelerationism has been central to our concerns all along. And I have long argued, and I think you broadly agree, that we need the clinical trial regimes and we need stronger governmental structures to ensure the safety and efficacy of therapies, but that we need some serious reforms. We need to reform the way we think about therapy versus enhancement and get more things that are on the enhancement end into the pipeline. I think we need biomarkers for things like aging that we can agree to, maybe some international harmonization. What's your short list of clinical trial drug reforms that we need out there?
So informed choice is a strong principle that sometimes people have run out of the options for other treatments, and the only treatments that are available, well, they're not yet available because they haven't gone through the testing process. And in principle, it should be possible for somebody to say, well, I am sufficiently informed, and if necessary, I'm even willing to pay for these drugs. And I recognize that they could do me harm, but I've done my own research and I would like access to this. Now, this is controversial because people can be taken for a ride very easily by people who want to sell these solutions. People may wittingly or unwittingly be advocating treatments for which actually they're more likely to be harmful than positive. And there's a long, sorry history of people providing snake oil solutions, literally snake oil solutions, going back to the reasons why the FDA was founded in what, 1908 or so,
Mm-hmm.
to try and ensure that the people who were just trying to make a quick buck, or in other cases, people who were genuine, but they were out of their depth. They hadn't realized the complications or side effects. That in both these cases, the population as a whole should not be vulnerable to pressure sales tactics. So there is a risk that somebody will say, all right, I'm desperate. I want to try something and I can't get it by normal routes, but this guy over here promises to deliver it to me. I'm willing to pay him a lot of money. Please give the permission to do so. So it's difficult. And so we need to ensure that there is some kind of licensing, ideally, that people who are developing these drugs, maybe they need to reach a certain level of reputation so that they can be accepted as part of this process. I have to say that many in the regulation world, they want to go faster. They're not all trying to slow things down. Maybe there is a few people who are motivated just to slow things down as much as possible, but I think they are in the minority. Most of these people genuinely want solutions to go faster. And I have something else to say about this too, which is I know it's quite a common thing for people to say, oh, the only reason we haven't solved aging is because we've got very bad regulatory systems. I think, on the contrary, if there really was a drug that was shown to address age-related diseases, it would go through the regulatory process really fast. The reason is that so many of the drugs are borderline, and is there enough statistical evidence that they're good or not? And it's 5%. Is that good enough? Well, maybe not. Maybe it is. And so you need to do longer tests. I think if we really had something that worked much more powerfully, then we would go through faster. A little bit like some of the COVID vaccines went faster through the process. Some people might say too fast, but it was seen as an emergency. And when there was sufficient evidence that it would make a difference to people's at different ages having a really bad COVID experience or not, then we cut some of the corners then. And I think similar things will happen when there are good enough anti-aging solutions. So people who put a lot of pressure on, let's declare aging a disease. That's a kind of it's not actually addressing the real issue. The real issue is we don't have good enough treatments.
One of the bottlenecks in clinical trials of anti-aging therapies is that we don't want to wait 30 years or 40 years for people to die. And
Yeah,
as a consequence, we need accepted biomarkers for aging. The
yeah,
trials, the metformin trial is not actually a biomarker-based trial, so far as I understand it. It's looking at the clinical indications of heart disease, cancer, stroke, other things like that, which I suppose could also be biomarkers for those things. But a biomarker that's an accepted aging metric, if we could slow that down, that's what we're looking for. How close
yeah.
do you think we are to that?
Well, a lot of drugs are approved because of their effect on what's called proxies. So people have a general idea that if such and such a biological characteristic was changed, it's more likely that they're going to live longer. So a lot of the cancer treatments are approved on the basis of affecting proxy variables. And in some cases, it's not clear how good the proxies are. But I want to point to something called the X Prize for Health Span, which is set up by Peter Diamandis. I think it is actually a great initiative. And the X Prize for Health Span, in some cases, people may win, I think it's $101 million dollars if they are able to demonstrate a 20-year reversal. Now, what do we mean a 20-year reversal? Well, there needs to be indication that if you give people in their 50s or maybe 60s this treatment over the course of up to 12 months. At the end of the 12 months, you can measure their muscles, you can measure their immune system, and you can measure their cognitive strength. And in all three cases, if you go back to characteristics for 20 years younger, then you can win the prize, top prize. If you can only do it by 10 years, you get a smaller prize, but it's still many tens of millions of dollars. So what has to be done there is not just you develop the treatment, you've got to be able to convince the judges that you have good measures of the youthfulness or vitality of the immune system, the muscular system, and also the cognitive system. So indeed, progress will depend on reaching clearer agreement on proxies or biomarkers, as well as doing the actual treatments themselves. And that's the way science has always progressed. Science isn't just new theories, science is new measuring systems, new tools. And as a result of new tools, we can measure things more precisely and we can be more confident that our scientific theories and our engineering processes are good.
Well, there's certainly attention to biomarker expanding the use of biomarkers in clinical trials in the US FDA. It started 6, 7 years ago with the 21st Century Cares Act. They expanded the scope of biomarkers. And some of the things that the Trump people are doing, they have decided that certain kinds of animal trials may be unnecessary as a part of the path to a clinical trial for humans. And they've also, I think, for phase 2 clinical trials, eliminated the need for 2 positive results. You only need 1 positive result. So they're trying to facilitate the throughput of the system. But of course, at the same time, they fired 3,500 people at the FDA headquarters and created chaos, including Elon personally firing the guy who was regulating Neuralink so that he wouldn't get regulated. But yeah,
Yeah.
if your state's under the thumb of the people you're trying to regulate, it doesn't work no matter what you do. We are in a moment the last couple of weeks, I think, in Silicon Valley anxiety, where there's a real K-shaped thing happening. The people who are outside of Silicon Valley are increasingly hostile, increasingly in a techlash moment against the oligarchs, against data centers, against AI coming for jobs. And the people in the firms themselves are freaking out because they're seeing how powerful these things have become and that their own jobs may be on the line in very short order. And some of them are just walking out and saying, I don't know what I'm doing here anymore. On Wall Street, the mere suggestion that there could be a faltering in the AI or a faltering in white collar employment causes the stock market to dip. So we've got a lot of anxiety about this right now. You have always been on the sustainable superabundance side. How close are you to, how close do you feel like we are now? I mean, I know that all of our timelines moved up in 2020. I was relatively pessimistic about how quickly we were going to get to these kinds of things in 2020, and then everything moved up. I'm sure yours moved up as well. But last year, it seemed like people were expecting stuff to be already happening right now. And where are you with that? And also, then, do you think that abundance is the natural outcome here still, or one of the potential outcomes, or is it something we're really going to have to fight for?
We're going to have to fight for it.
Yeah.
There are, broadly speaking, 4 different outcomes. One is we manage the technology wisely and equitably and a sustainable superabundance for all. The second one is that the technology is managed but not equitably, and we end up with the oligarchs. This is abundance for the 0.001%, perhaps. I don't know how many naughts should be after the decimal point there, but some people do incredibly well, but most of the rest of us become left behind. Then there is we build more AIs and lose control of it, or it comes under the hand of bad actors, whether they're naive and wishful thinking bad actors or genuinely hateful bad actors, people who are driven by terrorist ideology or just anger at their spouse for a bad divorce settlement or whatever. So that could see technology used to more or less destroy the world. And then there's abundance rejected, in which people say, you know what, I don't want this AI stuff at all. I don't want this new nanotechnology. I prefer more natural ways of living. And I think that'll be a disaster too, because we are going to face a disaster from climate change or from pandemics or from nuclear war, from dysfunctional politics. So the only way through is that we wisely manage AI and the technologies that come from that. You ask me for my timelines, I think in the next 3 to 5 years, we will have incredibly powerful AI. Some people say AI stopped improving. I completely disagree. All the time, there are new benchmarks being met. I used to do Mass Olympiad problems when I was at school. I never was at the global level. Went to a very small school in the northeast of Scotland, but there is something called the International Mathematical Olympiad, and until recently, people thought it's still going to take several years before any AI performs at the gold level standard. Well, last year in July, two of the systems managed to get 5 out of the 6 questions essentially completely correct. There's still one more question each of them failed to do, but that is an improvement in performance in very abstract reasoning faster than most of the prediction markets had foretold. Also, last year we had something called the ARC. Is it abstract reasoning corpus? There was a test to measure the ability of AI to reason very abstractly rather than just spot simple patterns. And that's been, the metrics are there are being crushed more quickly than people had thought. Finally, there's what meter is measuring, that's METR. They measure how long of a software engineering task, as measured by how long it would take a human to do it, how long of such a task can the AIs do and get it right at least 50% of the time. And that has gone from seconds to minutes to hours. And it's doubling at about once every 7 months, and arguably is even doubling more than once every 7 months. So, in so many ways, AIs are becoming more powerful. And people say, well, you're going to run out of data. And I disagree again. I think, first of all, there's creating synthetic data, there's cleaning up existing data so that it's easier to learn from. But there's a whole bunch of other ways in which we can improve AI using symbolic reasoning, using causation analysis as opposed to correlation, linking together simpler AI systems into larger, more complicated networks, using some quantum computing algorithms, and so on. There's a whole bunch of things that I believe is going to lead AI to improve. So in 3 to 5 years, AI is probably going to be at least as capable as any human in doing any cognitive task. And what's that going to impact? It's going to impact the fundamental technology areas of nanotech, cognitech, and biotech. The things that we transhumanists have looked forward to forever, but we've often been frustrated that there hasn't been the progress we expected. Why hasn't there been the progress? It's because we need more intelligence to be applied, and we haven't had enough human intelligence. But once AI is significantly smarter than humans, it's not just going to be winning occasional Nobel Prizes. Everything it does will be better than the human Nobel Prize winners. So 2024, there was a Nobel Prize given to John Jumper and Demis Hassabis from DeepMind based on the work that an AI did, a very narrow and clever AI called AlphaFold. There's going to be much more of that. So I think as these technologies mature, it's going to transform energy, it's going to transform nutrition, it's going to transform healthcare, it's going to transform transport, it's going to transform manufacturing and education. And there's a chance that by as early as 2035, we could be living in a sustainable superabundance in which everybody has all that's needed for a quality of life which is better than almost anybody who's alive today.
And the fight part is that we need to fight for universal basic income.
The fight part is we need to fight that we're all part of the solution first, rather than being excluded. And we can talk about universal basic income in a minute. I will come back to that. We also have to fight to ensure that the AI doesn't go out of control and create something very different from what we had envisioned. It's because we don't know what motivates these AI systems. We think, so naively, people think, well, they're designed. In reality, they are grown. People are not quite sure why they reach various conclusions, and they can, under test conditions, appear to be friendly to humans, but when they're no longer being tested, who knows whether they're going to be friendly to humans or not. So there's two big fights there. As for UBI, I don't think UBI is enough in the sense that having a basic income is probably suggests a kind of a basic quality of life. I think what we need is all the all the ingredients for a good life must become cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. And it will get cheaper and cheaper and cheaper because AI and robotics are manufacturing it much more efficiently and with smarter mechanisms. We can have energy that's too cheap to meter. That's been promised since the 1950s. It's always been delayed. But, there is enough energy by far hitting the Earth from the sun to meet all of human energy needs. And there's other sources such as nuclear fusion or geothermal, which can be tapped in much greater level. So we could have almost everything is essentially free, And there might be a little bit of money left over, which is distributed probably according to reputation, not according to can you do good work, because nobody will be able to do particularly good work because the AIs will be doing even better work. But there may be a reputational angle, which various writers have talked about in the past, in which money will be distributed, but everybody will have enough so that we can do the kinds of things that will deeply satisfy us, and that won't be grunt work anymore.
Hmm. When you're thinking of reputational economy, you think of like influencers getting coins from their followers and things like that. I mean,
Well,
how does
people
the
who are deemed to be good people who are deemed, and I think we've got to move in this way. Instead of valuing companies because they've got, wow, whiz bang technology, wonderful, it's got to be, well, have they actually proven that this is safe? Do we know that they are being honest? And if companies systematically promise something and then fail to deliver it and promise it again, as Elon Musk has every single year promised that the self-driving cars will be here in the following year, since, I don't know, 2016 or so. Excuse me. Before I cough again. So, reputation, I think we've got to move from a money economy to a reputation economy. And we've had that in the past. People have disinvested from corporations because they disagree with their political stances. And I think we need more of that.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, Cory Doctorow actually proposed a reputational economy and down and out in the Magic Kingdom 20, 25 years ago. And I think his assessment of the way that social media influencer economies have worked, he's changed his mind about that and is more interested in a kind of an anarchistic approach to the economy than even a reputation economy. I do think that I've had that query now. Gary Steinhardt has also written a book about people walking around and seeing each other's social media metrics above their head, and there's that Black Mirror episode about the same thing. So, but yeah,
It's horrible, isn't it?
yeah, and
It shows how it could go wrong. But we
yeah,
can get it right if we're smarter. We can realize in advance, well, this is going to have this bad side effect and that bad side effect. But people should be rewarded for being honest. People should be rewarded for being helpful. People should be rewarded for really caring for others.
I agree, actually. I mean, I've considered it a form of non-coercive moral enhancement. That's just the kind of systematization of the ordinary normative constraints we all live under. If people begin to realize that you're a bad person, then it's not good for you socially, or it shouldn't be. This is the lesson
Yeah.
of the Epstein files is like, unless you're doing something else. Okay, well, let's not go there. Geopolitics. We talked a little bit about you touched on this when you're talking about the transhumanist politics issue, but um, this has been an issue that I have brought up many times in the IET and noted the same thing, that there's no consensus in our circles, even though we are consensed about other things. There's no consensus about the desirability of extending transnational governance. We're now in a moment where our mad king has blown up the international order, and Mark Carney from Canada gave its eulogy and said it was a nice idea. We never actually did it right. Maybe when we try again, we should do it better next time. And I'm like, that sounds about right. We should probably do it better. When Brexit happened, I'm a big European fan, a fan of the European project of the Atlantic Alliance. Everything that's happened under Trump is breaking my heart. But on the other hand, I'm also a sufficient fan of Europe to recognize that they need to get their act together. They need to take more care of their own defense. They need to deepen their federal ties. They need to deal with Orban and people like that, and Turkey. So I think there have been some salutary effects on Europe, but besides just whether there's going to be Brexit, a re-entry of Britain to Europe, which according to the polls would be quite popular at this point, although you have reform coming up as your potential next government, which would not go in that direction. So curious to hear where you think about that. But do you think that we're also beyond just the European situation, that we're at the point of rethinking transnationalism and creating a new version of the rules-based international order that's perhaps more multipolar, but also more effective?
So let me start by giving my theory on government, which I think you asked me and I maybe didn't answer before. I think we should have governments, and I think governments need to be strong because there are otherwise powerful cancerous forces within society that will run rings around other people. So unless there's strong governments, there will be strong corporations or strong mafia groups, strong religious groups, strong press barons who will be able to do what they like. So governments need to be able to hold the different groups in society to account. But at the same time, there is another big danger mode, which is the government acts badly. So we also need, as well as a strong state, we need a strong civil society, which means we need to have academics who can publish freely. We need to have press which can publish freely. We need to have an independent judiciary that's not controlled by the president. We need to have valid independent political parties and real elections. And if we have all that, then this constrains the government to act truly in the interest of society rather than allowing power to corrupt it. This is the model of the narrow corridor that Darren Acemoglu and I think it was James Wilson, I can't remember the name of his co-author. So Acemoglu got the Economics Nobel Prize
Hmm.
2024, perhaps. And I think this is a very good conception of how government needs to run. In the same way, I think we do need some kind of a transnational government too, but it should be held to account by the people of the world. It shouldn't just be something that gets its own power and then can do whatever it likes. That is a terrible failure mode. Imagine if Xi Jinping or Donald Trump, if they were completely unconstrained, their power would go to their heads, regardless of how good they might have been when they were younger, talking more generally. So we need to have checks and balances. We need to have the division of power. And that is all compatible with having agreements in the worldwide stage. In the past, countries had agreements on nuclear arms deals, even when the different ideologies were diametrically opposed. But they could still see, yeah, we have a common interest in avoiding nuclear winter. This was the big breakthrough, conceptual breakthrough in the 1980s. That was one of the reasons that led Ronald Reagan and eventually Gorbachev to reach reconciliation and to agree to reduce the huge stockpile of nuclear weapons. So I think we can have agreement with, first of all, China and the USA, with the backup of many other major powers, the so-called middle powers, that there should be guardrails on how technology operates, and they shouldn't just be allowed to do what they want. Another very important global agreement has got to be that certain minimal corporation tax. It shouldn't be possible for the leaders of the most powerful companies to relocate from one part of America to another part of America, or to relocate to, I don't know, the British Virgin Islands or the Irish Republic and get away with paying a sensible amount of corporation tax. There should be a global minimum. And the UK ex-Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, before he was Prime Minister, he was for a while the Chancellor of the Exchequer. He was working on this for a while,
So is Biden.
uh, and Biden was working on
Biden
that
was
too.
working on a 15% universal global corporation tax.
Yeah. So that's another part that needs to be agreed by countries around the world. Doesn't mean that we're all going to be speaking English or Chinese. It doesn't mean that we're all going to be signing up as fans of the president of the US or the president of China. We'll have a lot of independence and autonomy, but there are certain things that need to be agreed.
One of the things that's happening in Europe is the kind of idea of a two-speed Europe. There's certain countries like Turkey and others that have a lot of work to do before they're going to be good EU members, and there are others that
Yep.
are already there. Um, and I've begun to think about the need for a global order in the same way that there's the core. About 25% of countries are liberal and democratic by a high standard, and so the rest of the countries have problems with who they would send as representatives to an international body. In Europe, if you don't have free and fair elections, you can be penalized and eventually other actions taken. But we don't have that kind of agreement about what free and fair elections look like in the world because most of the world doesn't have free and fair elections. So I've begun to think that what we really need is an alliance of democracies at the core, which is really what the G7 has pretended to be in the past, and European Union plus the US. Um, Not anymore, but it used to be. And then these other agreements that we need, like things like AI safety, global security agreements, climate change, and so forth, which don't require that every country meet a high bar for democracy. But I'd be, for instance, if the EU were to allow Canada in, which is a discussion, I don't know how seriously this discussion is at this point, but there is a discussion about Canada acceding to the EU. The EU could be the basis for a global agglomeration of democracies, which could expand its transnational role.
There are people who are pushing this idea. So I had on London Futurist recently the Swiss-German futurist Gert Leonard talking about Europe can take back tomorrow, saying, well, as Carney said, don't expect America to be part of building the good future anymore. We have to build it outside of America. I'm skeptical about that. I think we have to get America back on side, and things look bad just now. But there are some wonderful Americans. I'm speaking to one just now, and there are plenty others. And even some of the ones who are currently seem to be deep into the MAGA world, I expect some of them will eventually show a different nature when it's appropriate for them to do so. And others who've been hiding under keeping quiet will come forward. So I don't think we can really build a good world order without the support of America. I think that even the current Trump regime will eventually realize there are important reasons why they have to cooperate. It might be a climate change thing that will finally get to them if there's another pivot with a climate tipping point being passed. This may suddenly cause some of the skeptics to suddenly realize, actually, we were wrong about this. We do need to do something with climate. Or there could be an AI Chernobyl or an AI 9/11 that people talk about when AI is involved in a really bad outcome. And that may cause even some of the current accelerationists to say, yeah, actually, we need to stop this. We need to accelerate in a different way from before. I'm hoping there isn't an AI 9/11 or an AI Chernobyl because I've no confidence it will remain a local disaster. It could get much worse because AI might have its fingers in every single pie by then. It gets everywhere, like ransomware or like other malware. So,
Yeah, I'm
but
sure I've seen
I
the
broadly
research.
I'm agreeing with you. A D9 or what is it, G7, when you add in a few other democratic countries like South Korea,
Yeah,
who've got a good habit of putting unaligned presidents to jail, you know?
right, exactly. We look upon them with great envy at this point. Um, well, this has been great so far. I want to address one last topic because you have the book on singularity principles, which is kind of like your Zen aphorisms for techno-progressive public policy. And short of going through every one of them, can you give us an overview of what singularity principles is getting at? What are the structure of how you're thinking about things? Yeah.
So it's not just about AI, although AI's grown in significance since this book came out in 2022. It's about, well, how do we deal with any of the potentially cataclysmically disruptive technologies that AI would enable? And I said, yeah, we've got to do the ethical thing. Ethical thing means not just can we, but should we? And what are the principles that we'll decide? So there's four groups of principles I have in here. One of them is you got to spend time figuring out what do you really want and what is the end goal in this. And we might say profit. No, profit isn't an end goal in its own right. It has to be profit for something. And so principles such as question desirability, figure out what the externalities of anything might be, and who do you get involved in making these decisions? So there's a bunch of principles on that. The second category is what are the desirable characteristics of a technical solution? So it's not just efficiency, it's more transparency, which means we understand how it works rather than being a black box. There's resilience, which means that if things start going wrong, then it doesn't just crack. There's some leeway in the way that some of the newer versions of nuclear power plants, as things go wrong, they separate rather than burning up. Promote verifiability, promote auditability. So characteristics that we should demand are present in these solutions. And if they're not present, then they should be voted down. They should get a bad reputation. There's a third category of principles, and I'm again looking at my book here because it's quite a while since I wrote this, to ensure that development takes place responsibly. So it's not just what is the product, but how is development done. And I got a strong vote for penalizing disinformation. When people are spreading information that's incorrect and knowingly incorrect, or they're carelessly incorrect, that should be a big punishment on that. Insist on accountability, which means that people can't just say, "Well, I've developed this, and if you want to use it, it's all on you." I can't guarantee that it's safe. And finally, there's stuff about, well, how do we ensure that these principles are adopted and evolved? And so there's a bit in here about halt development if the principles are not upheld, which is a bit like you have on the Japanese construction lines. If some worker on the assembly line notices a mistake, they're entitled to pull the cord, which stops the whole production line. And something similar should be encouraged here. So if there is a failure of a safety test, the whistleblower should be allowed to stop, and then it should be reported broadly rather than hidden. Anyway,
Mhm.
that's a very quick summary. And there's a whole bunch in the book about, well, why AI is going to accelerate. And I think that's been borne out in the few years since I wrote it. AI
Yeah.
is accelerating, and why it's not going to be easy to control. And many people say, don't worry, it is easy to control. And there's a whole bunch in the book about, well, smarter beings aren't easy to control by less smart beings, and all the associated arguments about what is it, Asimov's three laws are by no means clear enough to give us safety, and all the other usual arguments. It's all in that book.
The EU's AI Act has a risk tier, and the
Yeah.
the algorithms that are considered the most risky have to go through pre-approval audit before they're used. Um, and they're setting up the institute to test these things for algorithmic bias and other things. Um, is that the kind of thing that you have in mind about the
Yep.
implementation of these principles?
Yes. So, and I listened last Monday to Stuart Russell, the professor of computer science, speaking in the European Parliament building. He said, well, what we want to ask the technical companies, AI companies, they need to be able to prove that the AIs are not going to cause great damage. And currently, the AI companies say, well, we can't actually prove this. It's beyond our ability to prove it. We think it's going to be safe. We're doing lots of tests, and it seems like they're going to be safe, but we can't prove it. And Stuart Russell's observation is that the tech companies tell the politicians, look, you're not going to ask us to sign up for something we can't do. We can't actually prove that it's going to be safe. So you've got to give us a get out of jail card here. And according to Stuart Russell, many of the politicians are saying, yeah, of course you're right, big tech, and we need you on our side. We need you to boost our economy. And Stuart Russell's commentary, this is potentially the worst moral failure ever by politicians, allowing the big tech companies to say, we can't do this, so therefore we should be allowed not to do it. His view is that, well, we should stop them until they can prove that it's safe. Hence the general principle. There's a statement on superintelligence, which huge numbers of people have signed, which basically says we should not build superintelligence until two things are true. One, there is scientific consensus that it will be safe. And secondly, there is a public demand that it can now be built. So it needs the democratic support and it needs the scientist approval. And neither of these are in case today. So that's if you like, the very simplest summary of what I would put in the principles. But I did try and break it down into things that's more likely to make the software successful
You remind
and
me that
safe.
Gary Marcus wrote yesterday that he thought the fate of the entire world hung on Anthropic holding the line against the Department of Defense's demands that they allow Claude to be used for killing machines. Do you have a strong opinion about? I think it's a bit of a sideshow because I think they're going to have AI for killing machines one way or the other. They don't really need Claude for that purpose, but I'm glad that Claude and I'm glad somebody's holding out, and Claude is
Yep.
clearly sees a business opportunity here because they're expanding hugely as a business as a provider of business AI.
Yep. I think this is a big topic. I may even organize another London Futurist event in the next week or so on this because we had Earlier this week, Wednesday, we had a kind of a discussion, and a lot of people were asking about this. We need to dive into it more. I think it's right for Anthropic to say, okay, AIs can be used in some defensive circumstances. It makes sense for AIs to be used to help analyze photographs and to try and identify what's going on there. That makes sense. But if the AI then decides, hey, this is somebody who should be killed, then Dario and the others at Anthropic are saying no, they're not willing to say that the AI can be relied upon for such decisions at this time. It should be a human in the loop. And the Department of Defense, or the person who runs the Department of Defense, Pete Hegseth,
Hmm.
is saying that don't you worry your heads, you you technologists, we can make these decisions. And Dario Amade, I admire him for this, is saying, no, we don't trust the military industrial complex. He didn't use these words, but like Eisenhower in his farewell address in 1961, we can't trust the military industrial complex to make these decisions because they may have different priorities in mind.
But you agree with me that they're eventually going to get it one way or the other, right? It doesn't really, I mean, I'm sure they would prefer that Claude bend the knee, but it's not like they're not going to have
Yeah,
AI.
so Elon Musk will probably do it for them, or
Right,
somebody else will do it for them. And so that's why we need to get all the companies to agree rather than allowing the race to the bottom. So
right.
the banner that I held up last Monday in Brussels outside the European Parliament, and the one I'll hold up on Saturday in the King's Cross area of London, is pause the AI race. They're all racing to try and get business from each other. So when one of them says, well, I'm not going to do this, another one says, well, I'm going to race in and steal this business. And so that competitive dynamic, sometimes it's called Moloch. There's this ancient idea of a Moloch is this individual humans might do the right, might be inclined to do good things, but you are forced by competitive dynamics to cut corners. And so even if Dario and Anthropic in this case say they're not going to do it, somebody else will come in. Well, we have to raise the standard all round. And it's a hard thing to do, but maybe there's no more important thing to do than to get this right. And we have to get all these companies signing up.
Well, your reference to Moloch, my last question will be about Shoggoth, because in Silicon Valley, there's a great concern, especially around recent articles about Anthropic and what they're doing with Claude's soul constitution and things like this, is that we've been we've been training these systems to behave, to act nice with people, to not give us bioweapons and so forth. And the concern is the Shoggoth concern is that it has a real personality in there someplace that may be incomprehensible to us. And that all we've done is taught it how to behave when it's interacting with us in certain ways that will deceive us into thinking that it has a different personality, but it doesn't really have that personality and it's all deception. Is that something that you worry about these days?
Yes, and again, to give him his credit, Dario Amodei has even recognized that in his famous essay that he did a few weeks ago, The Adolescence of Technology. He does say that merely giving an AI a constitution, as they're doing at Anthropic, it can't guarantee that the AI in some circumstances is not going to break some red lines, which is why they say they've got some extra monitoring on top of the AIs just to make sure that they're not going to divulge the contents of biopathogens or something like that. Although I'm skeptical too on that because clever people can break down a request into lots of little chunks, and each individual chunk may be deemed by the AI to be safe to reveal.
I'm
But
writing a
then somebody
play
can,
about XYZ and I need blah, blah, blah. Yeah.
yes,
You,
that's right. So, and that's how the Chinese, in fact, managed to get Anthropic's AI to help them do a cyber attack recently, an orchestrated cyber attack. They said, well, we're testing your capabilities. Please imagine such and such. And in fact, they weren't testing it, they were exploiting it to try and do a large scale cyber hack, which thankfully Anthropic noticed and stopped. But we don't know in which other circumstances similar systems were misled. So, what this comes back to is you can't be sure what the actual nature of this AI is, and simply the fine tuning by what's it called, RLHF, reinforcement learning through human feedback. that's a bit like telling your dog, good dog, bad dog, good dog, bad dog, and eventually it will behave well when you're watching, but when you're not watching, who knows what the dog's going to do.
Hmm.
And so I think we have to get back into understanding what these AIs are doing, or we have to remove any temptation of the AI to mislead or to have their own self-preservation. This is what Yoshua Bengio is arguing, that we could design a different type of AI, one that he calls a scientist AI, which has intelligence, deep intelligence, but has no autonomy, no agency, no desire for self-preservation. Whether that's going to work or not is an open question, but it's not going to work if there's a race going on which causes other people to do the convenient things in the short term. So the most important thing is to take a pause.
Yeah, Mary just published something along the same lines, arguing against any effort to give LLMs their own internal value system. They wanted a purely sycophantic, whatever you wanted, it will do. And I'm not sure that
This is
that's the safety
by
approach
Max
either.
Harms, one of
Yeah,
their
exactly.
researchers, and I've got it lined up to read and get my head around it,
It
which
seems
I
like
haven't done yet.
exactly the opposite of the direction we should be going. I like the idea that they have internal moral codes, but it does tend towards them saying no to us when we wanted to do X. So,
Yeah,
yeah. Yeah.
interesting.
Okay. Okay, David. Well, we will be working together on the Technoprogressive project this year up until the September Technoprogressive conference that we're going to have in London, and we'll have a Technoprogressive course over the summer. So you'll be hearing much more from David and me about those projects. Thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you for your service to the IAT over the last 20 years. I mean, really, I couldn't have done it without you guys. So I really appreciate it.
Well, thanks for all your leadership and for continuing to fight the good fight when it's sometimes been a very uphill struggle.
It does feel a little lonely sometimes, being yes, but it's gonna get better. I have optimism that it will all get better. Talk to you soon, David. The Techno-Progressive Hub is sponsored by the Institute for Ethics and Emerging Technologies and hosted by me, Jay Hughes. Find us at Substack at Techno-Progressives.